Thank you very much, and good morning everyone. It's an absolute honour to begin day 2 of the fascinating conference, and I'm really looking forward to picking up from yesterday afternoon's discussion. It just segued so nicely into this session. So, like I was introduced, I'm Rachael Jones, Assistant Archivist at the University of Strathclyde, Archives and Special Collections in Glasgow, Scotland. And as well as managing the university's records and our other collections that extend over 2 kilometres and 50 terabytes, we are the place of deposit for the research outputs of the Scottish Oral History Centre, and this was established in 1995. Recently, we have seen an increase in demand for both access to oral history recordings and researchers wishing to deposit their projects with us for the use of other researchers. What better way to meet this demand than hosting the audio files directly on our online catalogue? We have the technical capability, and indeed we already have oral history projects available to listen to online, such as one investigating women's experiences of work and factory closure in the 1960s to 1980s in Glasgow. These digital capabilities provide an excellent opportunity to bring the historically and traditionally marginalised voices of society right to the fore and provide access at just the click of a button. This quantum leap in dissemination, as Sherna Berger-Gluck has it, raises many ethical concerns, however, that have taken on a new significance when this worldwide scale of discovery is considered. It has always been understood that in the oral history world, that the narrator's wishes must be honoured above all else. The right of the interviewees to have control over access to the material is seen as inarguable. Though even where consent forms record narrator compliance with dissemination for research purposes, Gluck rightly notes that for many projects that were carried out prior to the digital revolution, the forms were signed before global dissemination on the web was a possibility. So can we really assume consent for a scale of dissemination that couldn't have been conceived of by the original narrators? For the purposes of this paper, however, I'm going to focus on those collections of interviews for which we have robust consent forms that even specifically include online dissemination, for there are plenty more ethical considerations that reach beyond even the all-important wishes of the narrator. And it's one of these that I would like to explore with you now. The ethical issue of third-party sensitivity has come to the fore in the light of digital dissemination capabilities. Gluck highlighted this issue, comparing it to the wishes of the interviewees when reflecting on web dissemination. She said the disclosure of personal information about others in these interviews might be an even greater source of concern, especially today. One example from our collections that really highlighted the need to establish a workflow in this area are a suite of interviews with those working in residential childcare in Scotland between 1960 and 75. While we had really good consent forms for that collection, which related to the permissions granted by the interviewees, those individuals discussed in the narratives, and particularly vulnerable children that the interviews were working with at the time, didn't agree that their details be shared at all, let alone on a global stage. I actually initially struggled to find much literature in archival or oral history journals that discussed how we might deal with this third-party sensitivity issue. And it seems to have taken a bit of a back seat as an ethical consideration in the UK, certainly, until the Data Protection Act 2018 implemented General Data Protection Regulation in 2016. The most comprehensive treatment I found about it actually was on the Oral History Society UK website, in their section, Being Legal and Ethical, where they declare that we need to be more vigilant than previously to third-party references in recorded interviews. Even if an interviewee has given consent to the use of their own personal data, it might still not be possible to make their interview publicly available if it contains sensitive data about other living and identifiable people, which might lead to those parties suffering substantial damage and distress. Apologies for a lengthy quote, but it encapsulates it quite nicely. So, given that this is something that we must be aware of, especially if we want to disseminate oral histories online, what steps can we reasonably take to ensure the safety of third-party information while maximising access to these viable oral history testimonies? And what ethical issues do these steps in turn pose themselves? So I would now like to propose 3 solutions with a discussion of each of their implications before concluding by attempting to reconcile elements of each of these solutions into a practical model that we could use to balance protecting the information against encouraging access, all of course within the harsh reality of very restricted resources. So solution 1 is to perform a sensitivity review on each interview submitted to the archive and to redact from the transcript and the recording all sensitive third-party information. The British Library has produced a very helpful oral history sensitivity rating guide and form for this very purpose. The first and most obvious counterpoint to raise in answer to this solution, however, is the phenomenal resource that would be required to listen to every interview that comes to us. The Oral History Society understands that this would be a huge task when they say that very few, if any, organisations have the resources to listen to every minute of every recording which they are planning to make publicly accessible. This is especially true of our situation at Strathclyde, given that we're a very small team with no archivist dedicated to digital collections specifically, let alone our oral history collections, and I am so sure we're by no means alone in this. Even those interviews that have transcripts often require us to listen to them in their entirety, as in our experience, transcripts are very imperfect representations of the audio. We've actually found quite a few cases where portions that existed in the audio have just not been reflected in the transcript at all, with no indication of the omission. Another counterpoint concerns the ethics of redacting the testimony of those individuals who are offering up their stories. We surely have a duty to protect living individuals who are mentioned in our oral history collections, just as we do in our textual collections. However, Kevin Bradley and Anissa Puri rightly suggest that redacting sensitive stories is to alienate a valid narrative from the historical record. This desire to avoid censorship is particularly pertinent to the field of oral history, where we want to celebrate information that fills gaps left in the official or bureaucratic records. Solution 2 is for us in our role as archivists and not the creators of oral history collection, where that is the case, to take a step back and just to absolve ourselves of making sensitivity and redaction decisions. We might follow the example of the National Library of Australia, who don't practice redaction at all in their oral history collections. The NLA doesn't accept interviews where the narrator has requested anonymity, and they say the NLA prefers not to edit for anonymity, as this would tamper with the historical record, and it is a time-intensive practice. And any interviews that they have flagged as high risk in terms of third-party sensitivity are closed altogether until a certain date. We might also devolve sensitivity checking to the creators of the oral history interviews themselves and require that they supply us with a sensitivity information as a condition upon our housing the collection. The Louis B. Nunn Centre for Oral History at the University of Kentucky encourages the interviewer or donor to play a good part in describing each interview they donate, and this greatly aids archivists in creating descriptions of the interviews for their catalogue. In this manner, we might require that oral history creators provide sensitivity assessments and therefore take this resource-intensive task off of our to-do lists and onto their own. The oral history manual extols the virtues of interviewers preparing their work prior to deposit in an archive, when they say, interview processing and attention to planning for curatorial care of the recordings, while time-consuming and not the most glamorous part of the oral history life cycle, pays years of dividends, and I can only say amen to that from our point of view. Indeed, as I've said, the Oral History Society UK website provides excellent guidance on the sensitive personal information of third parties, and it recommends to oral historians that at the end of every recording session, write up the interview content summary and sensitivity form, which would just be wonderful. They even provide a template based on the British Library form that you can download. In reviewing this potential solution, I would have to begin with a somewhat candid reality check that we would be very unlikely to have great success introducing another suite of forms for donors to submit to us along with their collection. It can be challenging enough for us to ensure that we have all consent forms and general project documentation as it is, and the time resources of oral historians themselves aren't plentiful, and we might risk not receiving collections at all by imposing another administrative task on the creators. If we followed the model of avoiding the collecting of sensitive stories and not accepting anonymity conditions, like the NLA, I believe we would similarly be at risk of losing valuable stories from the historical record. the Oral History Society agrees that any immediate restrictions on access and reuse are far outweighed by the longer-term benefits to historians in the future of a full and frank interview. And after all, archives have always played the long game with the aim to preserve materials for future generations, and this was actually discussed yesterday as well. Ultimately, though, we as archivists simply cannot absolve ourselves of our duties to the information that comes into our care, and we can't devolve these duties to others. Nancy Mackay stresses that the curation of oral histories is as important as their creation. As soon as we accept the interviews into our repositories, we become data controllers under GDPR and the data protection legislation, and our integrity as custodians of the historical record relies on our active and ethical stewardship. Solution 3 is to decide that it's just too high risk to make the interviews available online at all, and instead concentrate efforts on high-quality catalogues for discovery. Perhaps the transcripts, requiring fewer resources to assess for sensitivity and to redact, could be hosted online in favour of audio files. If researchers then require access to audio files, they can get in touch and fill in a data protection declaration stating that they'll not share personal details of third-party individuals. In answer to this last solution, though, I would say that we're now through the looking glass. We're well past the stage where we can deny digital dissemination altogether, and I don't know that we would necessarily want to. For one, the primacy of the transcript that was very much in the early days of the field of oral history, discussed by Mary Larson and Douglas Boyd, among others, is no longer necessary, and we've already touched upon the inadequacies of the transcript as a substitute for the audio, especially in this day and age. The technology exists, and the appetite is well and truly there for immediate access to the voices of the past. Boyd reminds us, rather harshly, that inaccessibility in an internet age means obscurity and irrelevance. We must endeavour to democratise access to oral histories that themselves purport to democratise the historical record. Boyd goes on to enthuse about the possibilities of digital dissemination when he says, enhanced access to incoming and past digital donations of oral history materials may, in fact, change the historical record in truly profound and potentially transformational ways. We are right to be cautious, however, and take our role as data controllers seriously. So after examining these three solutions, I think we begin to see that it surely must be a combination that's the answer. There's no doubt that hosting oral history interviews directly on our online catalogue, using the digital capabilities that we've got at our disposal right now, is certainly the goal that we should aim for. As with many aspects of human endeavour, though, we fall short of the ideal situation due to lack of resources. 'Twas ever thus. This diagram helps to visualise the relationship between processing time and its relation to the risk of releasing sensitive third-party information into the public domain should we place interviews online. So the more time spent on reviewing and redacting, the lower the risk will be, and vice versa. The question we need to ask ourselves now is, what level of risk are we happy with? And are there any other mitigations from within the solutions discussed above that can help control this risk while reducing the required resources? I feel that a risk management approach would be useful here, having mentioned the word risk several times. The National Library of Australia use a colour-coded or traffic light system when grading levels of access to their interviews. We might use a similar system to describe on the level of processing each interview requires in the first place. With this system, only collections that scored a risk level of medium or above would require full review and redaction for the purposes of online dissemination. And they could be made accessible to researchers upon request prior to the completion of the review. It might be that resource restraints mean that full review joins a lengthy queue, but collection descriptions would at least be discoverable and access could be requested. This grading could be the first step in a workflow similar to the evolving methodology of the British Library that is described on the Oral History Society website. So the British Library are working on a pathway where they do an overview assessment of each collection to identify particular sensitive content intrinsic to interviews. They then do a word search of all content summaries and transcripts for a lexicon of words and root words that are likely to indicate sensitive content. They then practice targeted listening to those sections containing the words to assess whether they might lead to third-party distress or suffering. They classify any sensitive data in order to measure risk and then carry out their muting and redacting. The British Library are also looking into voice recognition technology to produce transcripts for interviews that have no paperwork. We could add further to this an investigation into using AI. I know some speakers talked about it yesterday, in some of these procedures to further reduce resources required in this initial checking stage. However, might even this risk-driven approach to selecting what oral histories are hosted online serve to neutralise the historic record? Mary Stewart and Cynthia Brown raise a very valid concern when they say that only the more bland and non-controversial material is then made available in the public sphere. Such an outcome would be a loss for the whole research community, reducing the power, immediacy and detail that gives oral history testimony its unique power and impact. Nevertheless, the information must be protected within the confines of the resources at our disposal, and surely if we provide high-quality catalogue records to aid discovery, this will enable the more high-risk collections to join the historical discourse. Michael Frisch describes digital curation as a key to unlocking the rich complexity of oral history documents and thus widening the possibilities for their meaningful use. And digital curation surely includes catalogue description. Moreover, this measurement of risk to inform processes doesn't preclude making high-risk collections available online. It merely flags up for which collections we must be prepared to expend those extra resources to ensure that all third parties are safeguarded, while also simplifying the workflow for those lower-risk collections. As you can hear, I have many more questions than answers about this topic. At Strathclyde, we're still very much in the process of designing and implementing a workflow based on a risk model similar to what has been discussed here. So I will be fascinated to hear the next two presentations in particular, and really interested to pick your brains, hear the thoughts of others at the conference. So thank you very much for your time.